On behalf of our office, we'd like to welcome everyone today to our Diversity Speaks Community Edition. For those of you that have been with us throughout the year, you know STHM's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion have been bringing you provocative and fantastic information around diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. Today will be no different, and I'm sure we will not disappoint. One of the things that we want to keep in mind here is that we are in different times. We're in times of struggle. We have social injustices that we're all trying to navigate through. We're all developing and cultivating that advocate within us. And so there's a call to action for everyone to be very self-reflective on how they see themselves and how they see others as we move through life these days. One of the initiatives out of the STHM ODEI is this idea of welcoming and creating a sense of community amongst all of our stakeholders, our students, our staff, our faculty, our alumni, and the general public, the folks, our partners that come to do business with us. So today we have a unique opportunity with our capacity building trainings. The Diversity Speaks, which is typically geared towards our students and our alumni. We created these community editions because our students were saying, we want to know that our faculty and our staff and all the folks that you're bringing to STHM understand the importance, understand the need for having these conversations and creating critical dialogue around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we have done 2 community editions that have been fantastic, where we've opened the door not only to our staff and students and alumni, we've opened it up to the general public like we have today. Today is really unique in that we are co-sponsored by the Fox School of Business, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council. And we have a very large audience that has included a lot of our stakeholders from around the world. Through Zoom, the world is a little bit smaller, so we've actually been able to invite a lot of folks that have never heard anything about STHM or anything about the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and today will be your foray into that. So before I turn it over to my colleague, Ms. Naima Hall, I want to just cover quick housekeeping. We have a fantastic audience today, and at the end, we're going to try to leave about 15 minutes or so for Q&A. Please use the Q&A function that's at the bottom of the screen for Zoom to bring those questions forward. Full disclosure, we may not be able to get to every single question that we have here, but we're going to do our best to address as many as we possibly can. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce my co-director, Ms. Naima Hall, to introduce our speaker, Mr. Tim Wise.
Thank you, Dr. Blair. So today's community edition of Diversity Speaks will focus on anti-racism and the call to action to eradicate systems, practices, and mentalities that encourage oppression and violence towards marginalized ethnic groups. Our conversation today will be led by a renowned anti-racist writer and activist, Mr. Tim Wise, who will candidly address race issues and methods of action to dismantle racism within practice and conduct. As one of the country's leading anti-racist authors and educators, Tim has authored 9 books, including his latest, Dispatches from the Race War, and his acclaimed memoir, White Like Me. A regular contributor to discussions about race on CNN and MSNBC, with appearances also on hundreds of other radio and television programs, including the more recent Netflix special, Hello Privilege, Wise has also been featured in several other documentaries, including 2 from the Media Education Foundation, White Like Me, Race, Racism, and White Privilege in America, which he co-wrote and co-produced and has been called a phenomenal educational tool in the struggle against racism. Named one of 25 visionaries who are changing the world by Utne Reader, Wise has contributed to chapters on essays of over 25 additional books, and his writings are taught in universities and colleges across the nation. His essays have appeared in Alternet, Salon, Huffington Post, Counterpunch, The Root, Black Commentator, Big K Nation, and Z Magazine, so many that goes on and on and on, so many other popular and professional journals and scholarly journals. So, but I don't want to keep talking about Tim. You didn't come here to see us, you came here to see him. So without further ado, I present to you all today in a candid, provocative discussion, Mr. Tim Wise.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today, even though I know it's not really with you. It's this thing that we do and have been doing for the last year. But I think in this particular moment, it is especially an honor to be able and important for me to be able to talk with you about these issues of equity and racial justice, because we are in the midst of still really the largest sustained racial justice uprising in the country's history, just in raw numbers. In the past year, since the killing of George Floyd, there have been somewhere between 7,500 on the low end, maybe 10 or 11,000 on the high end, depending on how you count them, protests, demonstrations, rallies, or other public events for racial justice in that last year. And the estimates are that those events have included upwards of perhaps 20 million different Americans. So it is truly the largest sustained uprising for racial justice in the country's history. So it's a very important time, obviously, to be talking about these issues, not just with regard to the criminal justice system, which is obviously implicated in the killing of George Floyd and the larger issue of police misconduct, but even with regard to the larger subject of racial equity in the labor market, in the educational system, and of course, with regard to public health and healthcare, because we're in the middle of another racial justice emergency, not just the criminal justice side of things. We're in the midst of a COVID-19 pandemic that is not just a public health crisis. It is that, but it is also a racial justice emergency. The pandemic is what gave us the space as a country to really sit back and pay attention. You know, for 400 years, white folks in particular, but to some extent, anyone that wasn't Black, had the luxury of sort of hitting that snooze button on the racial justice alarm clock. Black folk, indigenous folk, I mean, they sort of had to stay on it for those centuries and all of those generations because they were the ones who were most at risk. But for those of us who were white in particular, it was very easy to hit the snooze button on the alarm and go back to bed. The challenge is, are we going to be able to sustain this focus that we have arrived at over the course of a year when we get on the other side of COVID, which they tell me is going to happen like any day. I don't know. I'm double vaccinated. I'm good. I don't know about the rest of y'all, but they say that we're going to get on the other side of it. And I hope so. But when we do, right, when all of a sudden we go back to our normal routine, right, we go back to class, back to work, back to hanging out with friends, going out, doing our thing the way that we were before COVID, are we going to stay as focused, or are we going to hit the snooze button again? That's an open question, right? And so we really have to ask, how do we maintain the commitment? How do we maintain the focus when the headlines fade, right? How do we maintain the focus on the upsurge in anti-Asian and anti-Pacific Islander violence, 3,800 events in the last year, incidents of overt hatred aimed at Asian Americans and Pacific Islander folk? We know why, because of the constant blaming of Asian folk for COVID-19, and particularly Chinese folk for COVID-19. That's why it's happened. And when COVID is over, and hopefully if that uptick in violence goes away, are we going to stop thinking that racism is a problem? Or are we going to say, oh, well, there hadn't been a hate crime, you know, that we've heard about in the last couple of months, or, you know, no Black folks have had knees put on their neck for 9.5 minutes by a police officer in the Twin Cities. So gosh, I guess we're good. Like, you know, is that what we're going to do? How are we going to maintain the commitment when maybe the obvious stuff is not right in front of us? Because see, that's the thing about racism in America and about racial injustice in America. It's sort of like the iceberg, right? They always tell you that an iceberg, like 10% of it is above the waterline, maybe 15%, and the other 85 to 90% is beneath the waterline. So you don't always see it, but it's there. That's the same with racial injustice, right? The 10 or 15% that you see, yeah, that's important, and we have to deal with that. But the 85 to 90% is the stuff we got to deal with that otherwise we overlook. And that's not stuff that you can necessarily address by protesting and going into the streets and having demonstrations. Those are important, but this is the work that we have to do in our schools, and the work that we have to do in our workplaces, and the work that we have to do in our family and in our neighborhoods and in our places of worship for those who are people of faith, and, you know, at the nonprofit organizations that we contribute to and that we're a part of, and the civic organizations, whatever. It's a lot of stuff that isn't going to get headlines that we have to do. It's a lot of stuff that isn't going to make the history books that we have to do. It's stuff that you can't take a picture and put it on Instagram for, right? It's the stuff that we have to do on a daily, ongoing basis. How do we do that? What does that require of us, right? Regardless of what field of endeavor you are in or go into, regardless of what field of study you are studying in school, what are the things that are required in order to really handle the 85 to 90% that's beneath the waterline? Because that's the systemic piece. See, we throw this language around, and we don't always get real clear on what it means. So we should be clear, right? We talk about systemic racism, and sometimes people get very sort of defensive about that, right? If it's a hate crime, yeah, they know that's racism. They get it, right? If it's a cop with his knee on the neck of a black man for 9.5 minutes, some folks understand that's racism. Some folks would still have you believe it's not. So that's a different lecture for a different day, perhaps. But the obvious stuff is sort of easy, right? But the systemic stuff, when you say that, people are like, well, what do you mean? Do you mean everybody's racist and every system is just overflowing with bigots? No, see, that's the thing about systemic racism. It isn't about that at all. Systemic racism is not about overt hatred and bigotry. Systemic racism is about the embedded, sedimented, institutionalized inequality that has developed over many generations. Inertia isn't just a property of the physical universe. It's also a property of the socioeconomic universe and the political universe and the historic universe and the cultural universe. The things that happen in one generation affect the next and the next and the next, right on down the line until a force of equal or greater power pushes against it to stop its forward trajectory. So systemic racism is the racism, the racial inequity, the racial injustice that has become embedded in the soil as a result of that forward motion. And that's not going to always be obvious. It's not always going to be blatant, but in order to really uproot it, you have to be clear that that's the adversary, not just the individual bigoted cop. Are we going to be a multicultural, pluralistic democracy, or are we going to be an ethnocracy, a fundamentally cultural supremacist belief, a classist belief? So we have to challenge all of this. Really creating equity means we have to do three things. Repeating, number one, understand the origins of the country and the way that inequality has happened by design, not by accident, number one. So we're clear-headed about that. Number two, understanding the way that systems are maintained by the fundamental ideology of America, which rationalizes all of those inequalities and makes it harder to undo them, and makes it harder for us to see all the ways that just everyday policies and practices like old boys networks, for instance, perpetuate inequality. And then finally, engaging this debate about what America is and is going to be. Because it's really fundamentally a debate between those who say we need to make America great again and those who believe that the real goal is to make America great for everyone for the first time. That is what the battle comes down to today in 2021. And I appreciate the opportunity to have spent this time with y'all, to chat with you. I know we could talk about a million more things. We got about 17 minutes, roughly 20 minutes for questions. So I look forward to that. Thank you all so much for having me. I look forward to getting up there at some point in the future in person and doing this that way. But again, thank you. It's been a real honor and pleasure. I appreciate you.